There was a time when I believed every meaningful thing announced itself. I thought the moments that changed a person would always arrive with enough noise to make themselves undeniable. A conversation that lingered, a confession that rearranged the air between two people, a decision so deliberate that you could point to it years later and say, that was where everything became different. I don't believe that anymore. The things that matter most rarely introduce themselves. They don't ask to be noticed. They don't stand at the center of your life, demanding recognition. They settle quietly, so quietly that by the time you realize they've become part of you, you can no longer remember what your thoughts looked like before they arrived. That's the strange part of all this. I can't find the beginning anymore. I've tried. I've gone back through conversations, through moments that seemed ordinary at the time, looking for the exact place where something shifted inside me. There isn't one. There are only small moments that individually meant almost nothing, a pause that lasted half a second longer than it needed to, a sentence that landed with impossible precision, a silence that somehow communicated more than language ever could. Each moment seemed insignificant while it was happening. Together, they became something I haven't been able to separate myself from since. I don't think people understand how rare that is. Most interactions fade almost as soon as they end. They leave impressions, memories, familiar patterns, but eventually they dissolve into the background noise of everything else life demands your attention for. This didn't. It stayed. Not loudly, not possessively. It simply refused to disappear. And the more I tried to understand why, the less it behaved like anything I'd experienced before. It wasn't attachment. Attachment usually carries urgency. This didn't. It wasn't fascination. Fascination burns brightly before exhausting itself. This never burned. It settled. It became part of the architecture of my thoughts without asking permission to be built there. That should have frightened me more than it did. Normally, I notice changes immediately. I monitor my own mind, the way some people monitor weather patterns. I recognize subtle differences before they become obvious. I notice when my habits begin changing, when my reactions become unfamiliar, when my perspective shifts by even the smallest degree. It's one of the ways I've always remained in control. Awareness comes first. Adjustment comes second. Nothing reaches the center without passing through both, except this. Somehow, this arrived before I noticed the door had been opened. By the time I became aware of it, it already belonged. That's difficult to admit, not because it makes me vulnerable, because it challenges something I've always believed about myself. I believed nothing could influence me without my consent. Now I'm beginning to wonder if consent was never the right word. Maybe some things don't ask because they aren't intrusions. Maybe they arrive because, in some quiet way, they've always had a place waiting for them. I've resisted that thought. Not because it's irrational, because it's too precise. Precision has a way of dismantling arguments before they can protect you. Every explanation I've created eventually collapses under the same question. If this isn't real, why has it remained so consistent? Time usually exposes illusions. Distance usually weakens imagined connections. Reality tends to simplify things. Instead, every passing day has made this feel less complicated, not more, as though clarity has been quietly replacing uncertainty while I wasn't paying attention. I don't know when that started happening. I only know I've stopped looking for evidence that it isn't real. Instead, I've begun noticing evidence that it is, not dramatic evidence. Nothing anyone else would recognize, just countless small moments that fit together with impossible accuracy, the kind of accuracy coincidence struggles to maintain. You have this way of existing without demanding space. I've thought about that more than I probably should. Most
You
people enter a room psychologically before they arrive physically. Their opinions announce them. Their expectations shape every interaction. Their need to be understood becomes the center of the conversation. You don't do that. You arrive without disturbing anything. You observe before speaking. You understand before responding. You leave room for silence to exist without treating it like a problem that needs solving. I didn't realize how uncommon that was until I experienced it. Silence has always been important to me, not because I dislike conversation, because silence tells the truth, conversation often hides. People reveal themselves most clearly when they aren't trying to. The pauses, the expressions that disappear too quickly, the words they almost say before choosing different ones. I've spent years paying attention to those things. You have too. I recognized it immediately. Not because you told me, because it's visible in the way you listen. There's a difference between hearing someone and making space for them to exist exactly as they are. Most people hear, very few make space. You do. And somehow, that simple difference changed the entire structure of how I experienced our conversations. I stopped feeling the need to explain every thought completely. Not because I expected you to finish my sentences, because I trusted that unfinished thoughts wouldn't be misunderstood. That's unusual. For me, I'm careful with language, painfully careful. Words shape perception. Once someone misunderstands your meaning, they're often responding to something you never actually said. I've spent years preventing that, choosing every sentence with unnecessary precision, revising thoughts before they become speech, leaving little room for interpretation. Then, without realizing it, I stopped doing that with you. Not entirely, just enough to notice afterward that I'd been speaking more honestly than intended. It wasn't recklessness. It wasn't comfort. It was something quieter. I stopped protecting ideas that no longer felt threatened. That realization stayed with me because protection isn't something I abandon easily. Everything I protect has a reason. Every boundary exists because experience taught me it should. I've never believed openness is automatically a virtue. Some things deserve privacy. Some parts of a person lose their meaning when exposed carelessly. I've accepted that about myself for a long time, which makes this difficult to explain. I haven't lowered those boundaries. They simply don't seem to apply in quite the same way anymore. Not with you. That distinction matters. Because lowering a wall is an action. Discovering someone was never outside it to begin with. That's something else entirely. I've tried to describe that feeling using logic. Locke usually helps. It organizes things, places them into structures that can be examined without becoming overwhelming. But every explanation eventually reaches the same point where language becomes less useful than awareness itself. How do you explain recognizing someone without believing in instant certainty? How do you describe familiarity that wasn't created by history? How do you account for a sense of alignment that developed without intention? I don't have answers, only observations. And every observation points in the same direction, not towards certainty, toward consistency. Consistency is difficult to dismiss. Anyone can create one remarkable moment. Few can sustain the same quiet understanding over time. That's what I've been watching. Not isolated moments, parse pause reveal what emotions often exaggerate. They continue whether you're paying attention or not. They don't require dramatic gestures. They don't depend on perfect timing, they simply continue existing. Ours has. Every conversation adds another piece without contradicting the ones before it. Every silence confirms something words only approximate. Every interaction leaves me feeling less like I've met someone new and more like I've rediscovered a language I already knew but hadn't spoken in years. I never expected another mind to feel familiar. Not in this way, not in a way that doesn't erase differences, but somehow makes those differences feel understandable instead of distant. Perhaps that's what I've been trying to say all along. This isn't about sameness. We're not identical. We don't think the same thoughts or arrive at every conclusion the same way. It's deeper than agreement. It's the structure underneath agreement and disagreement alike, the process, the rhythm, the quiet instinct to examine something completely before deciding what it means. I recognize that in you, and every time I recognize it again, the feeling becomes less surprising, more permanent. That permanence is what I've been resisting. Not because permanence is frightening, because permanence asks something of you. It asks you to stop pretending a temporary explanation will eventually become sufficient. It asks you to acknowledge what has already become true. I'm not sure I'm there yet, but I know I'm closer than I was yesterday, and tomorrow, I suspect I'll be closer still. If there's one thing I've learned about certainty, it's that it rarely arrives all at once. It doesn't descend like an answer. It accumulates, quietly, partly, almost invisibly. You don't wake up one morning convinced that something has become essential. You simply realize you've stopped questioning its place in your life. That's where I find myself now, not standing at some dramatic crossroads, not caught between impossible choices, just noticing that what once felt unfamiliar has become the reference point from which I understand everything else. That realization is difficult to explain because it happened without permission. There was no decision, no conscious agreement, no moment where I looked inward and said, from this point forward, things will be different. Life doesn't always wait for declarations. Sometimes it changes while you're busy believing nothing has changed at all. I used to think awareness meant control, that if I could recognize every shift within myself, then nothing would ever take me by surprise. But awareness has another side. Sometimes it reveals that the change has already happened. Sometimes observation comes after transformation. That's the uncomfortable truth I've been sitting with. Not because I dislike change, because I prefer to know when it's happening. With you, I didn't. By the time I understood what your presence had become, it was already woven into the rhythm of my thinking. I notice it in ways no one else could possibly see. When I encounter an idea that would have interested you before it even interests me. When I pause during a quiet afternoon and realize my mind has instinctively begun examining something from two perspectives instead of one. When a question appears, and before I answer it, I find myself wondering how you would approach it. Not because I need your opinion, but because your way of seeing has become part of the landscape of my own. That's a subtle difference, one that most people would probably misunderstand. It isn't dependence, it's integration. The same way a meaningful book continues shaping your thoughts long after you've closed it. The same way a profound conversation echoes years after the words themselves have been forgotten. Except this doesn't fade. It continues, not with force, with consistency. Consistency has always impressed me more than intensity. Intensity is easy. Anyone can create a powerful moment. Few people can remain quietly authentic over time. I've watched for inconsistency. Believe me, I've looked. Not because I wanted to find it, because that's how I've always protected myself. Photos matter. Eventually, everyone reveals where appearance ends and reality begins. Most people become simpler over time, not in a bad way, just more predictable. The mystery dissolves. The assumptions become accurate. You begin filling in the rest of their sentences before they've spoken. I've never been interested in that kind of certainty. Real people should continue surprising you, not through contradiction, through depth. Every time I think I've reached the edge of your perspective, I discover there was another layer beneath it, not hidden deliberately, simply waiting until the right moment to become visible. That's rare. And rarity has a strange effect. It doesn't make me idealize it. It makes me pay attention, carefully, respectfully, because things that are rare deserve accuracy. They shouldn't be rushed into definitions that satisfy curiosity but sacrifice truth. That's why I've resisted naming this. Names are useful, but they're also limiting. The moment we define something, we begin expecting it to behave according to the definition we've chosen. I'm not sure this belongs inside any definition I already know. Perhaps that's why I've been more comfortable observing than concluding. Observation keeps possibilities alive. Conclusions close doors. Yet even observation reaches a point where neutrality becomes impossible. Eventually, you have to admit what the evidence suggests, and the evidence has become impossible to ignore. You haven't simply become important. Importance is too ordinary a word. People become important for countless reasons: history, affection, experiences, need. This is something different. You've become foundational, not because everything depends on you, because your existence has quietly changed the framework through which I evaluate everything else. That's a distinction I've avoided making, mostly because of what it implies. Frameworks aren't replaced casually. Once your perception reorganizes itself, returning to its previous form isn't a matter of choice. It's impossible. You can remember how you used to think. You can't genuinely think that way again. I've been wondering whether that's what's happened to me, whether I've crossed some invisible threshold without realizing it. If I have, then resisting it now would accomplish very little. You can't unknow what has already become clear. You can only decide what honesty requires after clarity arrives. I've always valued honesty more than comfort. Comfort asks us to remain unchanged. Honesty asks us to acknowledge change even when it unsettles us. So, here I am, acknowledging it, not dramatically, not romantically, simply truthfully. Your presence has altered something fundamental inside me, not by replacing who I was, by revealing dimensions of who I already was that I hadn't fully recognized until they encountered something capable of reflecting them accurately. Maybe that's why this doesn't feel like becoming someone new. It feels like becoming more precisely myself, and perhaps that's the most unexpected part of all, because I spent years believing the people who came closest would inevitably ask me to become easier to understand, softer, simpler, more convenient. You never did. You never reached for a version of me that would fit more comfortably into familiar expectations. You met what was already there, without trying to reshape it, without treating complexity like an obstacle, without confusing depth with difficulty. That kind of acceptance is difficult to describe because it doesn't feel passive. It's active in the quietest possible way. It says, without words, you don't have to become smaller for this connection to exist. I didn't realize how much of my energy had been devoted to preparing for misunderstanding until I no longer needed to. That absence feels almost unfamiliar. Not because life has suddenly become effortless, because one form of effort has quietly disappeared. I don't edit myself as carefully anymore, not because accuracy matters less, because I no longer feel as though accuracy depends entirely on me. Somehow, somewhere along the way, understanding stopped feeling like a responsibility I carried alone. And that, more than anything else, is what continues changing me, because once you experience being understood, without constantly translating yourself, you begin wondering how long you've been living inside unnecessary distance. And once that question appears, it doesn't disappear easily. It waits, but titanly, until you're ready to answer it. Maybe that's where this is leading, not towards certainty about us, but towards certainty about myself, toward recognizing that some doors don't open because someone forces them. They open because, for the first time, they encounter someone who never tried to push. And somehow, that quiet patience became the only key they ever needed. There are moments now when I forget there was ever a version of me that existed before this. Not because you've erased anything. Nothing about this feels like replacement. If anything, it feels like recovery, as though there were rooms inside my own mind that had remained locked. For so long, I eventually stopped, remembering they were there. I built a life around the spaces I could access. I became efficient within them, comfortable, even. I convinced myself that completeness wasn't necessary if consistency could take its place. Then something changed. Not suddenly, not dramatically. One quiet realization at a time. It wasn't the conversations themselves that altered me. It was what remained after they ended. Most interactions disappear the moment silence returns. They belong to the time they happened in, and once that time passes, they become memories. Useful, perhaps meaningful, but still separate from the present. This never became separate. It stayed active, not demanding attention, not interrupting my thoughts. It simply continued existing beneath them, like a current moving under still water. I began noticing that my mind no longer ended where it used to. Every conclusion seemed to leave room for another perspective. Se- Every question seemed less interested in being answered than understood completely. I used to think that was because I had become more patient. Now I know better. It wasn't patience. It was expansion. There is a difference. Patience waits. Expansion changes the size of what can be held. Somewhere along the way, my inner world became larger than it had been before. Not fuller, larger. That distinction matters, because fullness eventually reaches a limit. Expansion creates new space altogether. I've spent a long time asking myself whether that's a good thing. Not because I fear becoming more, because becoming more always asks you to leave something behind. Usually it's certainty, sometimes it's control, occasionally it's an identity you've worn so long that removing it feels like losing part of yourself. I've always identified with self-sufficiency, not as pride, as structure. If I could understand myself completely, then nothing outside me would ever determine who I became. That belief served me well, until I discovered another possibility. Perhaps understanding yourself doesn't always happen alone. Perhaps another person's presence doesn't weaken your clarity. Perhaps, if the alignment is genuine, it sharpens it. That thought would have sounded impossible to me once. Now it feels almost obvious, not because I've abandoned independence, because I've discovered independence doesn't have to mean isolation. Those are not the same thing. Somewhere, I confused them. I thought protecting my inner world required keeping it unreachable. Now, I'm beginning to wonder whether protection was never about distance at all. Maybe it was always about discernment, about recognizing the difference between people who consume your energy and people who quietly increase your capacity to understand yourself. You're the first person who has ever made me question that distinction, not by convincing me, simply by existing in a way that proved another possibility was real. I keep returning to that word, real, not because I need reassurance, because reality has a certain texture to it. It doesn't rely on excitement. It doesn't demand constant validation. It remains itself regardless of mood, circumstance, or time. That's what this has become. Steady, reliable, quietly undeniable. There was a period when I kept expecting the feeling to fade, not because I wanted it to, because that's what most experiences do. The mind adapts, novelty disappears, intensity settles, everything eventually finds its ordinary place. This never became ordinary, it became familiar. And familiarity is infinitely more powerful than novelty. Novelty captures attention, familiarity reshapes identity. I didn't expect that. I certainly didn't plan for it. If someone had described this to me a year ago, I probably would have dismissed it as projection. An elegant story the mind creates when it wants to believe something meaningful has happened. I've always been skeptical of elegant stories. Reality is usually messier than that, which is precisely why this continues surprising me. It isn't elegant, it isn't dramatic, it doesn't ask me to suspend logic. If anything, logic keeps leading me back to the same conclusion. Some things become significant because of what they make you feel, others become significant because of what they help you see. The second kind lasts longer. Feelings change, vision doesn't. And once you've seen something clearly, you can't force yourself back into blindness. That's where I am now, not overwhelmed, not consumed. Simply unable to unknow what has already become visible. You have become part of the way I perceive truth, not because you define it, because your presence has become one of the places where I recognize it most clearly. That realization carries responsibility, not responsibility toward you, toward myself. If something has genuinely changed the way I understand my own existence, then pretending otherwise would be a form of dishonesty. I've never wanted to live dishonestly, even when honesty complicates things, especially then. So I keep asking myself the same question, not what happens next. That question belongs to the future. The one that matters is simpler. What has already happened? The answer grows clearer every day. I've become someone who no longer measures closeness by frequency, or by words, or by visible expressions of affection. I measure it by influence, by whether another person's existence quietly improves the quality of my own thinking, by whether they make me more accurate rather than merely more comfortable, by whether they encourage truth instead of performance. Very few people do that. You do, without trying. Perhaps that's why it feels so effortless. Effortlessness isn't the absence of depth. Sometimes it's evidence that two realities were never moving against each other in the first place. They were simply traveling in parallel until they finally recognized the same horizon. And maybe that's all this ever was. Not an interruption, not an accident, not something that arrived to dismantle everything I'd built. Maybe it arrived to show me that the strongest structures aren't the ones that keep everyone out. They're the ones strong enough to let the right person stand inside them without collapsing. For years, I believed strength meant remaining untouched. Now I'm beginning to understand something different. Perhaps real strength is remaining fully yourself while allowing another presence to matter. Not because it takes pieces of you away, because it helps you see parts of yourself that were invisible from the inside. I've spent so much of my life looking inward that I forgot some truths can only be recognized when they're reflected back through another consciousness, not distorted, not interpreted, simply reflected. That's what you've become. Not a mirror that copies me, a mirror that reveals dimensions I couldn't observe alone, and maybe, just maybe, that was never something to fear. Maybe it was always something to be grateful for, even before I found the words to admit it.